Hello, my name is Caden Heppy, and I will be discussing the Uyghur genocide in China. So just some background and some context, and we'll be covering Uyghur as a religious and ethnic group, the Xinjiang region, the population, cultural and religious practices, and its relationship to the CCP. So Uyghur refers to a predominantly Turkic Muslim ethnic group inhabiting various regions around Central and East Asia. They're native to the region known as Xinjiang, which is formerly known as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwest China. Some background on the origination of the Xinjiang territory that defined it as a predominantly Uyghur region. In 1949, China invaded the Uyghur homeland of East Turkestan, and since then, it has been occupied by the CCP and the Uyghur people. They have a population of around 12 million in China, and they speak mostly Turkic languages and practice traditional Sunni Islam. And among the 55 ethnic minorities in China, they are acknowledged by the CCP as one of them. So the genocide refers to a series of ongoing human rights abuses the CCP has committed against Uyghurs since 2014. And since then, the CCP has engaged in a heavy amount of policy and legislation to repress the Uyghurs. The policy has led to mass incarcerations and detention, destruction of religious sites, forced sterilizations and abortions, disrupted families, coerced marriages, torture, forced labor, and a litany of other human rights abuses. The international community reveres Uyghur persecution as genocide because it coincides with the conditions outlined by the Genocide Convention, which we'll be covering further in the presentation. And just a basis for the CCP claims for their persecution is that they claim that it is a necessary measure to prevent terrorism and Islamic extremism. So the repression of the Uyghurs in China is part of a larger campaign spearheaded by Chinese President Xi Jinping to establish the Han Chinese, China's ethnic majority, as a dominating force while simultaneously thinning out minority groups. The Chinese government views growth of ethnic minority populations as a threat to social stability, national identity, and devotion to the state. And one of the quotes that sums up this perfectly is spoken by a religious affairs official from China. Break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. Completely shove up the roots of two-faced people, dig them out, and vow to fight these two-faced people until the end. So there are some origins of the genocide. So all this, the CCP formal genocide campaign started in 2014. Action taken against the ethnic group began much earlier. The 1950s saw major migration and colonialism of Han Chinese to the Xinjiang region. The Uyghur population has since been dwarfed by the Han Chinese and now comprises less than half the region's population. Experts argue that Han colonialism in Xinjiang was deliberately organized by the state to dilute minority populations, spur ethnic unrest and tensions, and threaten the Uyghur culture. So just this is one of the significant examples of rising ethnic tensions in the Xinjiang region. In 2009, the Urumqi riots, which Urumqi is the capital of Xinjiang, occurred when there was a false accusation of rape of Han women by Uyghur men, led to the brawl between Han and Uyghur factory workers, which resulted in the death of 2 men. Ultimately, the protests turned violent, and hundreds of people were killed, and thousands of people were injured, and ultimately 6 men were sentenced to death following the riots. The CCP has used incidents such as this as basis for persecution campaigns against the Uyghurs. So on to mass incarceration. It's the most ambitious policy, the genocidal campaign. Around 2 to 3 million members of the ethnic minorities and the Uyghurs have been detained since then, many without formal charges and legal processes. This is the largest scale of arbitrary detention of ethnic and religious minorities since World War II, and they've identified over 380 facilities in the country. They're officially referred to as vocational and education training centers. Detainees are forced to sing songs and hymns praising Chinese communism and the Chinese state. They're forced to learn Mandarin. They're forced to renounce Islamic beliefs and pledge allegiance to the CCP. So there are pretty bad conditions within these camps. There's crammed dormitories, poor sanitary conditions, constant surveillance, and there's been reports of abuse, maltreatment reports, and reports of suicide. There's also been an extensive surveillance system meant to lock down the Uyghur people. There's also been reports of systematic rape, sexual abuse, and torture, prolonged interrogation, sleep deprivation, beatings, electrocutions, genital mutilation, and gang rape on a widespread scale. So one woman quoted, "Rape and torture has become a culture." In addition to this, the CCP has enforce sterilizations, abortions, and birth control on a widespread scale. This is the most explicit act of genocide against the Uyghurs. It is now one of the slowest growing regions within the country. They have been enforced forced birth control, including IUDs, abortion, sterilizations on a massive scale. Supposed state documents suggest that hundreds of thousands of women have been targeted. Continuing this, with the Article 2D of the Genocide Convention says that imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group constitutes an act of genocide, and this coincides with the actions that the CCP has been engaging against the Uyghurs. Additionally, the CCP has a policy of 2 children per family. However, there have been reports of heavily fining and even detaining family Uyghurs for having having 2 children, despite the legality. There's also been a large amount of religious persecution. Since 2017, thousands of Islamic mosques and other places of worship have been severely damaged, and only 15,000 remain since the start of the genocidal campaign. There's also been mass disrupted families where tens of thousands of children have been orphaned, and they've been placed into state-run orphanages. This also constitutes an act of genocide because, according to the Genocide Convention, the act of forcibly transferring children of a group to another group is an act of genocide. And finally, there's been state-sponsored and coerced marriages, where it's another effort to further dilute the Uyghur population. State has sponsored interracial marriages of Uyghur women and Han Chinese men, and women who essentially refuse to marry these men are subject to incarceration. There's been a certain amount of international intervention by foreign countries on this topic. Several countries have accused the CCP of genocide and called upon the state to cease its persecution of Uyghurs. They've frozen assets, travel bans, and imposed sanctions. And 39 countries signed a formal letter addressed to China to stop its human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. And the United States has been heavily involved in this process as well. Finally, and ultimately, the CCP used rhetoric as a means and method to justifying genocide. They've been masking the religious, cultural, and ethnic persecution of Uyghurs as a morally justifiable campaign against terrorism and extremism, and this accentuates the power of rhetoric. However, conversely, the rhetoric has been used as a positive method to combating ethno-violence, activism, and the diplomatic approach. So ultimately, citizens, activists, and governments are using the power of rhetoric to directly combat the Uyghur genocide. Thank you very much.